So, I'd like to thank our guest speaker today, Peter Maer. Everybody saw his bio, which is very impressive, and Peter spoke to us in the past. It was very well received, and he's been gracious enough to come back. The timing is really good because had we done this a week ago, a lot of things wouldn't have been quite final yet. But over the past 24 hours, there have been some changes. Just a couple of housekeeping things before we get started. Next week, we will not have a current events session because of Thanksgiving. So, you'll be able to just have all of your pent up anxiety and frustration, but you'll be able to release it again 2 weeks from today. We're going to have another special session in 2 weeks. I sent out some information about Jon Stewart's discussion with Stephen Colbert about recent anti-Semitic comments by Dave Chappelle, Kyrie Irving, Kanye West. And this is going to be a discussion that we're going to open up to the congregation as well, because I know that it is very important, very unnerving, very concerning. We're also going to be reflecting on what happened in Waukegan with the desecration of that cemetery. So that is going to be discussion material for 2 weeks from today. If you happen to be in the neighborhood, next Thursday, we will be having a Thanksgiving minyan at the synagogue beginning at 9:30. It's also Rosh Chodesh, so we are going to have about an hour service at that point. And I guess the only other thing that's upcoming is Banjo Shabbat, which is on December 2nd, a little bit unusual, but I'm going to do the entire service on my banjo. Hopefully there will be some people who are interested in attending that. So without further ado, we're going to be talking about the result of the midterms. And if we run out of steam on that subject, which frankly we might get tired of, you never know, Peter is going to give us some of his very interesting adventures being a longtime correspondent at the White House. So I mentioned that, Peter has been with us before. He's the father of our congregant, Jonathan Maer, and father-in-law of Michelle Maer, and grandfather. Two of the three I've already taught and trained for their bar mitzvahs. That would be Josh Levi, and I guess soon to come, Orly will have her bat mitzvah. I think it's about a year and a half, 2 years from now. Anyway, Peter, the floor is yours. We look forward to hearing you.
Well, thank you, Cantor. Stu, as you want me to say.
Absolutely.
I have to thank you so much for the education, the beautiful davening, and the ruach that you constantly bring to Am Yisrael. Our family and friends here in Virginia and all over the country who came to Levi's bar mitzvah are still, honest to goodness, talking about your role at the bar mitzvah in September. They just love the music and the ruach. I hope I don't say or do anything that would embarrass Jonathan or Michelle or Levi or Josh or Orly today. I'm going to try to be on my best behavior. Point of personal privilege, we're just so proud of Michelle's role in the greater Jewish community, working for Federation for so long, and Jonathan as your congregation's treasurer. But all of this said, I try to stay modest by recalling the advice that Golda Meir once gave to a speaker. She reportedly told this speaker, don't try to sound so humble because you weren't so great to begin with. And that's sort of the way I feel today. Just a couple of disclaimers before I start unloading here. I am retired. I was a straight news correspondent, but now I am unleashed and I can share opinions and viewpoints that I never would have voiced publicly or in many cases privately as a White House correspondent. Just a little personal background. I am a very proud native of downstate Granite City, where I was the only Jewish graduate. You're looking at 100% of the Jewish student makeup of Granite City High School when I graduated, out of 705 kids. That's also where I started in radio, but my first big career break came at Temple Israel in St. Louis, across the river from Granite City, where I was a second or third grade staff member on the Shofar newspaper. So that's how far back my desire for an ambition in journalism went. And I do hope that we have some time. I grabbed a couple of nuggets from my catalog of Jewish adventures in my travels with presidents from Carter to Obama that I'd love to share with you. Let's talk about the election and the fallout, and jump in, Cantor, if I'll take my cues from you on any questions or anything that anyone else has to say or ask. First of all, I don't know if you're aware of the breaking news on Nancy Pelosi today. The speaker has announced that she's not going to seek a leadership role in this next session of Congress. She, of course, is under just such extreme pressure with the terrible beating of her husband, Paul. And so this was a family and political and professional decision, and she has been talking about it just within the past hour or so on the House floor. I don't think that her Republican detractors are ever going to acknowledge what a towering figure she has been, and the legacy that she has as breaking the glass ceiling as the first woman speaker, the only woman speaker of the U.S. House, and just how she has just been such a brilliant political strategist and Washington player from the get-go. So on the election, I think a lot of this everyone on here knows. There are probably as many political nerds on here as I am. But I worked for CBS News as a contributor on election night. And like so many in the media, I went into it thinking that it was going to be a Republican blowout. And we now know that the red tide was, I hate to quote myself, but they asked me what I thought that night. And I said it was sort of a red puddle. Some people have called it a red ripple. But hey, look, the media totally, and many politicians in both parties just totally misread the mood of the electorate. And you could see it in a lot of the split tickets where, the voters went for a Republican on the national level, say for a Democrat for a senator and a Republican for a governor in many states, and vice versa. So we finally know the balance of power. And I think, it goes without saying that this is going to be a real era of uncertainty at best and total gridlock at worst here in Washington. Every midterm is a referendum on the president who's in office. And this one, though, is going to be remembered as much as a referendum on Joe Biden as it was on Donald Trump. I was reading a column by my friend and the veteran Washington Post political reporter, Dan Balls, who I've traveled the world with over the years, and Dan is still at it. And on page 2 of the Sunday Post, he said, Trump has changed politics in many ways, and Republicans paid a price for it last Tuesday. So, I think, Trump has energized the newly defined Republican base that Biden has labeled accurately MAGA Republicans. But Trump has also polarized the overall voting population. I think that Republicans and the voters who put them there are doing a victory dance today. The outcome from last week is anything but a mandate for the Republicans. They're doing that victory dance because the Republicans do have a very slim control of the U.S. House, as you know. But Trump weighed down his own party by choosing these weak extremist candidates in Arizona, in Georgia, where there's going to be a runoff on December 6th. I think Republicans, starting with Mitch McConnell, the veteran Senate Republican leader, who has been kvetching about the lack of quality candidates among Republicans, They know that better recruiting, maybe a former governor or a sitting governor, if they'd been asked to run, or a popular House member, could have given the Senate to them. They could have had total control of the United States Congress had it not been for some of these losers that Donald Trump chose. Of course, there were other factors that we know that came into play. Republicans have always successfully campaigned on the power to determine the Supreme Court by the United States Senate, by whichever party has control. Supreme Court justices, they've used the idea of votes to confirm Supreme Court justices to mobilize their base. But this year, the issue of the Supreme Court itself, by the way, the Trump majority Supreme Court, was an absolute liability for the Republicans. This, of course, started with the Dobbs decision overturning Roe v. Wade, and that fired up many women voters in both parties. Remember, the first warning came over the summer, and it was a stunner in solid red Kansas. There was that overwhelming vote to enshrine abortion rights in the Kansas Sunflower State Constitution. And that carried over to last week's election. You saw the Democratic governor of Kansas, Laura Kelly, who many had written off. She was returned to office by a 17,000 vote margin. As we look back on last Tuesday and since, California Governor DeSantis got most of the election night attention. He had that overwhelming win over former Governor and Congressman Charlie Crist. And we saw Donald Trump just seething because he couldn't stand the spotlight on DeSantis. He was so jealous about it, to the point that, of course, he had to come up with one of his sophomoric nicknames, calling the governor DeSanctimonious. And then, ever the bigot, Trump questioned whether another potential rival, the governor of Virginia, Glenn Youngkin, he said, gee, his name sounds Chinese. I mean, who but Donald Trump could come up with that kind of a formulation? I think reporters should probably, and people who were on the air that night on TV and radio, I think they should regret putting all the attention on DeSantis and detracting on emphasizing those that also won that night and could really have a future in their own parties. You look at the Democratic governors, Evers in Wisconsin, Whitmer in Michigan, two states near to you. Let's see, Polis in Colorado had a really big win, and Republican Mike DeWine in Ohio. And, you know, I can't forget Governor Pritzker's win. I don't think it was ever in doubt, but he earned some buzz on the national scene as he heads into his second term. I think those of you would know better than I if he harbors any presidential ambitions, but I think he's certainly one to watch. So I'll pause there, Cantor, to see if you have some questions. Yes, and of course, I am going to get to Shapiro of Pennsylvania, the Jewish day school dad. I am going to talk about him too.
You know, there's something that I thought of here. You know, you're talking about Trump's reaction to various things. I was wondering if you feel that the media is going to have a different approach to Donald Trump than they had in the past, because they received a lot of criticism for, either good or bad, constantly having Trump on the air. So when he was elevated into power, is because they continued to show him constantly. And I'm wondering if you feel that they've learned anything from that initial experience and may not give him the kind of platform that he had before, which would, you know, grease the wheels for his nomination.
I hope so. I mean, it you know, the act got a little long and tiresome the last time around. Where, I mean, it made for good television for the cables, you know. But I think we saw a good indication of coverage decisions when he made his you know, sort of low energy campaign announcement the other night. Fox pulled away from it after a certain point. They pulled away from it and went to their talking heads yakking about him. MSNBC, I don't want to say predictably, because I thought they'd at least cover at least until he declared, but they didn't cover him at all, not live. And let's see, CNN also pulled away from him. Obviously, none of the three-letter networks, NBC, ABC, CBS, none of them carried him live. The only one that did was Newsmax, and I don't know how many of the people I see on the screen here watch, ultra conservative Newsmax, but that has sort of become his free flow channel to be on. So I hope that it has changed. I mean, go ahead.
I see that as you're mentioning these different channels, one of the questions that came up from Phil Berry here is, what do you watch? What do you consider one of the more credible networks in terms of just giving straight out credible news without being slanted one way or the other?
Well, look, I guess I'm old school. I am, of course, partial to CBS because I worked there for 20 years and I know all the players, and you don't see any opinion on CBS. And I think, by and large, the same goes for ABC and NBC. Now, MSNBC is a whole separate entity. They're obviously liberal. There's a great debate right now going on in media circles and viewership circles as to where CNN is. But I think that you can really get a straight look at it by watching the ABC, CBS, and NBC. I also, just as a sort of by the way, I'm really proud and just pleased. CBS is just, I'd love to know, and I'm going to ask some of my friends, they have just gone out of their way with very thoughtful, perceptive coverage of this whole awful wave of anti-Semitism that's so upsetting to all of us. Every one of their broadcasts has done something, especially their morning show, which has, frankly, low ratings. But just on Monday, they had a panel of kids in California, high school students, talking about how the whole Kanye West thing has affected their lives and what it's like to go to school. And they asked like eight kids, raise your hand if you've experienced anti-Semitism, and all of them had. Have you seen a swastika in your school? Sadly, all but one of them had. But anyway, my point is, CBS has really done a terrific job on this. And one night, after one incident a couple of weeks ago, the anchor, Nora O'Donnell, who's a friend of mine, just as a personal statement, said, "We at CBS News stand by the Jewish community and deplore, what's going on." It's an easy thing to say, but you don't hear something like that too often when an anchor has like 22 minutes to give you the news.
Okay. I'm going to ask one more question, and if it's okay, I'll open it up for a few more before you continue. I know you're going to talk about Josh Shapiro.
I do want to, yes.
But you mentioned how you mentioned DeSantis, or the sanctimonious, as Trump called him. I was reading an editorial in MSNBC by a guy named Steve Bannon, or I think is his name. And he was saying that as popular as DeSantis is in Florida, it is not a reflection of the popularity outside of Florida, that he is perceived as a bully, as extreme, and they also used as justification, saying that he went around the country endorsing a number of the right-wing candidates, and almost every one of them lost. And I was wondering if you had any thoughts about him in terms of popularity beyond his state.
I really wonder, Stu, how he would translate in a broader election. I mean, this is a guy who promoted this so-called "Don't Say Gay" measure. This is a guy who found some immigrants down in Texas, and flew them to Florida, and then, flew them to Martha's Vineyard, and thumped his chest for doing that. Beyond the Latino community, I mean, I think to the Jewish community, when that just, those of us with grandparents and great grandparents and maybe parents who came to this country from other countries and maybe had to wait a while for their papers, you just have to wonder, how that's going to resonate, you know, with them. So that's kind of my take on it. I don't know how, he had a resounding victory there. I haven't seen anything on how the vast Jewish community down in Florida went on it. But, of course, who knows if he's going to have an opportunity to be on the national scene.
Right.
I think if he has his way, he will. There's hardly any doubt about his ambitions.
Good. Let me open it up. Put your little yellow hands up in the corner of the screen if you have any questions that you would like to ask before Peter continues on Josh Shapiro. Any questions out there? Yes, Howard Schickler.
Hi, this is partly a what gets covered question. With Ron DeSantis, what bothers me most is his policies, but what scares me most is the strength of his resume, being like an honors graduate of both Yale and Harvard Law School. And I'm wondering why, because I watch a lot of the coverage of him, it's never mentioned how strong his kind of intellectual background is.
Well, I see it mentioned in a lot of print coverage. Broadcast wise, they don't have the time or the wherefore to get into it. But you're right, he does have an impressive resume, and if you just watched him and just looked at his policies, it would be kind of surprising. But hey, Dr. Oz had an impressive resume too, and look what that got him. So yeah.
Well, when do you think that a lot of it has to do with the audience that they're trying to attract?
Yeah.
And if you look at the MAGA crowd, having Ivy League education is not the kind of thing that's going to attract that crowd. Just like you look at Donald Trump and you wonder how a so-called or alleged billionaire can relate to the common man who is the uneducated white folks in some of the rural areas. So maybe there is a reason why he doesn't want to highlight his credentials. I don't know, just a thought.
Exactly. As for Pennsylvania, we spent a lot of time on election night watching Pennsylvania very closely, and we had to wait until the next day to see that Fetterman won in the Senate race. But Pennsylvania, which when I was growing up was always, the big union state, very much like Illinois with the steel mills and all of the industry. And Pennsylvania was very much a Democratic state, but now it's considered purple. It kind of can go either way. And you have this close race between Fetterman and Dr. Oz, who was, again, Donald Trump's handpicked candidate. I don't want to obsess on Trump very much. I've got, you can tell, very strong feelings about him. I can't imagine what it would have been like to be a White House correspondent covering him. But as a friend of mine said, just play it straight. It would have been a challenge. But anyway, he chose Dr. Oz because Dr. Oz was, wow, a good-looking TV celebrity who's a doctor. And he thought that this guy from New Jersey was going to move to Pennsylvania and go away with all the goods on election night, but he didn't. Somehow Fetterman, despite having a stroke and despite his image wearing the sweatshirt and the shorts and so forth, he won, and he flipped the seat from Republican to Democrat there, and that's one of the reasons that the Democrats are holding on control. Now, you take Shapiro, who I didn't mean to gloss over, on my first go round, because I was saving just a little bit more about him because it resonates with all of us as Jews. He's a real moderate, self-described moderate Democrat. He campaigned that way. He was the attorney general. He's never lost a race, so he knows the formula in Pennsylvania. He was in the state house there roughly 7-8 years. He was then he was a county official in Philly, and took that seat, from what I've read, from Republican control. And he had a very comfortable win the other night. And this is a guy who he's a proud Jew. He wore his Judaism on his sleeve, if you will. No bones about it. And this creep that ran against him, Mastriano, was, trying to make it out that his kids went to some kind of elite school, and denigrated him for sending his kids to a Jewish day school. But from what I've read, he keeps kosher and sends his kid to that day school, and it seems to have resonated with voters there. And these are voters who know him well, because he's, like I said, he's been in the legislature, he's been in the at county level, and as their attorney general. So let's keep an eye on Mr. Governor-elect Shapiro.
Do you think that, just as we talked about DeSantis and maybe not having magnetism outside of Florida, do you think that Josh Shapiro, being a Jew, could actually have any national magnetism, or do you think that that would wind up being detrimental?
Oh, I don't know. It's just so hard to say. We've only had one Jewish candidate on a national ticket. I covered Joe Lieberman in that campaign long ago when Al Gore chose him. I was there the day he announced that selection. And if we get to some of my Jewish adventures, I've got a couple of funny stories about being with Joe and Hadassah Lieberman on the campaign. So, I think all of us here in Zoom land would love to think that it wouldn't be an issue to have a Jewish candidate for president.
Right. Any other questions before we move on? Okay. I don't think I see anybody. Okay. Peter, anything else you would like to cover next?
Well, I could, like I said, I don't want to obsess about Donald Trump. I could talk about him all afternoon, because I think that he's just been such an incredible stain on the national psyche. Yes, I know a lot of people, absolutely hero worship Donald Trump because he moved the embassy to Jerusalem, and I guess he does get credit for the Abraham Accords, something that, having traveled in the Middle East with 3 or 4 5 presidents, I wasn't sure I'd ever seen it. I've been to those countries that are part of the Abraham Accords, and that was a marvelous accomplishment. But I don't think he's good for the Jews in this country, to be honest with you. I think that he's given, I don't care what you tell me about his son-in-law and his daughter being Orthodox Jews and so forth. Hey, good for them. Respect them. But I think that with some of the things that he has said and done, and turned his back and winked, he's given license to a lot of bigotry in this country. He really has, and it all culminated on January 6th. And we saw a lot of anti-Semitism in the crowd that day. And thankfully, a lot of those people are going to have a nice vacation in a jail or a federal pen. But not long after I left the White House beat, I was on the CBS station in my hometown of St. Louis, and they asked me about Trump. And I took a deep breath, because I had never talked about a president that I covered, or any other president, in any personal terms. And I think I stunned the host, who was a friend of mine, at the risk of quoting myself, but I just said he desecrated and denigrated the office of the presidency from day one. And I think he'd do it again if he were reelected. look, he has said consistently that he's ready to pardon some of these January 6th, monsters. So, I put down here, I just saved a note from the Washington Post, what their lead was. And there were a lot of other great leads after his announcement the other night, but their lead was Donald Trump, the twice impeached former president who refused to concede defeat and inspired a failed attempt to overturn the 2020 election, culminating in a deadly attack on the Capitol, officially declared on Tuesday night that he's running to retake the White House in 2024. And in their last paragraph, they said he has profoundly altered the tenor of American public life, shattering long-held standards of decorum and civility with often shocking attacks on political rivals, judges, and reporters. He has frequently made racist and anti-Semitic remarks, mocked people with disabilities, denigrated developing countries, bragged about sexual assault, paid hush money to a porn star, praised dictators, declined to disavow extremists, inspired his supporters to resort to violence, and defended white supremacists and January 6th rioters. That in an accurate, straight news story, not in a commentary. And then I think a lot of you, if you pay attention, saw that the New York Post, owned by the Murdochs, put the story on page 26. I should have copied what they said, but they just said something like Florida retiree declares his candidacy for president of the United States.
Yeah, that's quite a resume that you read there. Wayne?
I wonder if you might talk a little bit about what you see, what we might look for in the future with a House of Representatives being run by a small Republican minority.
Thank you, Wayne. Before election night, I happened to run into a guy I know who's a veteran Democrat, power player, member of the United States House of Representatives. And this guy told me that he basically predicted what would happen. He said there's going to be a slim Republican majority probably, and that Kevin McCarthy, if he does become the speaker, not sure about that yet. We can get into the weeds on the numbers of people that he's going to have to get from his own party to support him. But, my contact, this congressman, said that he's just going to have a devil of a time running the House. I mean, you look at some of these people, my gosh, Marjorie Taylor Greene and Gates from Florida, and some of the others that are on the fringes of the Republican Party. It's not the Republican Party that you and I grew up with and you and I respected. Some of my favorite days of covering the United States Senate were traveling with and getting to know Bob Dole and some of the other, great Republican senators, Howard Baker. But, they would be laughed out of the Senate now by, being such moderate and conciliatory and thoughtful voices. John McCain, oh my gosh, you just go on and on. But I think that what we're going to see is a lot of bragging about going after Hunter Biden, which is, look, it's old news. Maybe there's something there. I don't know. I hadn't investigated Hunter Biden, but a lot of revenge. They are just itching to impeach Joe Biden. Is the country ready for that? It would be a revenge impeachment to do that. I don't know what the grounds of impeaching Joe Biden would be. So it's going to be messy. And, on the other side, the Democrats holding on to the Senate is a victory, obviously, not just for them, but for President Biden. They're going to be a firewall to some of the things the majority in the House are going to do. It's going to give the president and the Democrats what could be the final word on congressional debates that are going to be fomented on the House side, Wayne, on foreign spending, domestic spending. They won't be able to get it through because of the Senate. And it also means some challenging days for the Biden administration with these investigations. We've seen it over the years that, you know, these things have a way of really tying an administration's hands, you know, hiring more lawyers, experts on some of the things that they're going to be going after. They're going to probably from the get-go have a big investigation on that messy withdrawal from Afghanistan. I mentioned Hunter Biden. He's going to have to hire lawyers. His dad's going to be asked about every little nook and cranny that the Republicans you know, come up with. So, you know, again, McCarthy first has to win enough support to win this speaker's title and office that he has coveted. He's been measuring the drapes of the speakers, and there it is a lovely office. I've been in there. So, you know, he came up short in the trial run vote. More than 30 of his fellow Republicans voted against him to lead the party. So now he's going to have to go behind the scenes and cut all kinds of possibly crazy deals with people, promising them seats on various committees, powerful roles, maybe as a chairman, or you know, doling out favors, promising them certain things for their districts to get this speaker's job. He was on Fox last night. We fired Nancy Pelosi. You know, that has been their mantra. And he said that was the agenda that the Republicans earned, to fire Nancy Pelosi. You know, how long can they vilify this woman as one of their talking points? The act just gets a little old. It's really wearing thin. And I think that, you know, a lot of those guys were jealous of her because she outmaneuvered them for years and years and years. They never let up on her, even after her husband was beaten. The governor of Virginia, Youngkin, had to, you know, he decided to apologize to her for one of the things he said about her husband being beaten. You know, he said, well, this is going to send her back to California. So, as I said, she's not going to be speaker anymore, obviously, but as I said, she's not going to have a leadership role either. And it must have been a very tough decision for her. My question is, you've got a bunch of old guys there who are in the Democratic leadership, Steny Hoyer from Maryland, and some of the others. Hopefully they're going to set a step aside and let some young blood come forward on both sides, on the Republican and Democratic sides, and in the Senate too. It's time for some new blood. And frankly, in my very, very humble opinion, the two guys who are now mentioned as front runners for the White House are too old for the job, both of them.
It seems appropriate that the next Speaker of the House who's going to be in charge of persecuting innocent people would be named McCarthy, wouldn't it?
Yeah. I see a note here in the chat that I wasn't aware that Steny Hoyer stepped aside today. That was a gallant thing for him to do. I wasn't aware of that because I've been prepping to talk to you, and I had Torah study with my rabbi in the exact hour before you. I had to jump off of that and said, "Hey, I have to go to Am Yisrael now. I'm done with Olam Tikva."
Okay, we have a couple more questions here. I see Vera. Would you like to ask?
Sure. Hi, Peter. I know that nobody has a crystal ball, and especially so far from election for the White House. But I'm very concerned about DeSantis being nominated from Republican side. And I want to know your opinion, and I'm not going to hold you to it, but your maybe insight of who do you think can beat him? Because I'm very afraid he's very strong and very direct and very, you know, and I don't know who can beat him in their election for the White House.
You dropped out there. If you're talking about Trump?
No, I'm not talking about Trump. I'm talking about DeSantis. Ron
Okay,
DeSantis.
you asked who can beat him, but
yeah, because
are you talking about from a Democrat? Or are you talking
yes,
about within the Republican ranks?
No. If DeSantis is nominated for the elections, who on Democratic side can stand up to him?
Well, you know, first I'll say that at this point in the 2008 election cycle, say in 2006, had anyone considered a guy named Barack Obama? you know? So and how strong he turned out to be. And so we wonder, you know, which Democrats have a shot at this if Biden steps aside. And I'm not, you know, he says, I have every intention of running. He's going to be 80 years old in a couple of days. This job really ages presidents. You can just see it. And I just, you know, he wasn't a young kid coming into it. But I guess, you know, there are any number of these governors, the senators, the ones who ran last time around. I think Amy Klobuchar of Minnesota is a strong candidate. I'm not ranking them in, you know, in any order. Another woman, Michigan Governor Whitmer, boy, she has really shown staying power with all she's been had to face over there. And any number of Democrats, any number of senators who have those ambitions, I think they'd be formidable against him. And I do think, because of the things that we mentioned a couple of minutes ago, Vera, that this guy could be his own worst enemy. I think that, again, the electorate has shown that it doesn't have a stomach for extremism. And, you know, he'll probably try to tack away from some of these things and some of that he's done and said, but the record is out there. And I think that a lot of it could backfire on him. I really do. But first of all, he's got to get past Donald Trump. And Trump's got quite a war chest. You know, he had a real talent in this campaign of asking for money to help his candidates, but he kept most of it for himself.
Okay.
And you know, the gelt really talks in these campaigns.
Sure.
Thank you.
Howard?
Part of me is pleased that the Republican clown show in Congress is likely to be a contributor to further decline, you know, in Republican power. But the other part of me says real things actually need to be done by Congress, like a continuing resolution, like the debt ceiling. And I'm wondering whether we're going to hit gridlock. And part of the subset is that some of these Republican people are actually crazy. So that while we could depend on quasi-normal people not to veto an increase in the debt ceiling, I'm a lot more concerned about whether or not a Republican Congress, we need to be afraid of whether or not it'll stop that.
Well, look, you know, on both sides, on the Senate and the House, the Republicans, they don't have an agenda. And sometimes it seems like they don't have any leadership. Look what happened after January 6th. Both McCarthy and McConnell took to the floor of their respective houses and went after Trump. And then they went mute. I mean, when McConnell talked about no quality candidates, he never mentioned Trump at all by name. They can't bring themselves to do it. I mean, McCarthy, they had some very sharp words after January 6th. I don't have the quotes in front of me, but they quickly backed off because they were scared of Trump's political base. McCarthy even, you know, right after, several weeks after January 6th itself, and all that happened right outside of his office, he ran down to Mar-a-Lago and kissed Trump's ring. So, I think you're absolutely right, Howard, that there are just so many important things that have to be on the agenda, and hopefully saner minds will prevail, and they'll be able to get to the debt ceiling, and they'll be able to get to the climate crisis and all of the other pressing things that are on the agenda for the entire country. But I don't know. Sometimes I'm really cynical and pessimistic. I try not to be, but I just don't think it looks good to avoid the kind of gridlock that you talked about, and that all of us know that is out there.
Phil, and then Barbara.
Yeah. I'm very disturbed by the media's use of the term conservative to describe today's Republicans. I can't think of any of the people who worked on the rebirth of American conservatism who would call Rick Scott, DeSantis, Amy Coney Barrett, Kavanaugh, conservatives. And yet the media keeps giving these people the charisma of, I don't know, Ronald Reagan, to name a conservative. So what's keeping the media from really calling it as it is? I read some of the alternative media, and they say it's corporate reporting and big money. But I'd like to hear I'd like to hear your thoughts.
I think, Phil, it's a handy label, but it is inaccurate. And you pick something that disturbs me too, because when I think of conservatives, I think of Barry Goldwater, I think of Ronald Reagan, I think of Senator McCain, Bob Dole. Again, I guess I'm aging myself or whatever, but the list that you just gave, and it was a good one, they are not conservatives in the way that I think of conservatives. And frankly, there are a lot of conservatives in Washington who, have totally disavowed them. I think probably one of the best examples I can think of is Bill Kristol. If you follow Bill Kristol, who, not to be a name dropper, happens to be a friend of mine. His wife is the past president of our congregation, and Bill and Susan are very active members of our congregation. And I don't talk politics with Bill at shul, because we both kind of know that neither one of us wants to talk about politics at shul, of all places. But if you read what he's writing in an online post called The Bulwark, he and his cohorts are all former conservatives. It's amazing to see the turnaround of this guy who was the chief of staff for Vice President Dan Quayle and was a player in true conservative circles back then. And you see him every so often on the cables being the former conservative voice, and there are others also who feel the same way. So I can only agree with you.
Barbara?
I'd like it if you would talk a little about the Supreme Court and any possible attempt to neutralize its toxicity.
Well, we're seeing it, excuse me, we're seeing it going on now with the debate in the Senate on the Marriage Equality Act, which looks like it's going to pass, and they're going to be the firewall against the Supreme Court. The real worry that the Supreme Court was going to follow up on the Dobbs case by banning, putting a federal bar on same-sex and maybe even interracial marriages. Would kind of be a hard thing to imagine Clarence Thomas ruling for. But anyway, so I think the Congress is the way to go on this. But again, they're going to have to act pretty fast this time around. They've only got 3 weeks left before the Republicans take over the House. But that's the only remedy. I mean, unless the Supreme Court is expanded, which I don't think is going to happen. It's too much. I mean, this is just the greatest example of anything, Barbara, as I know you know, of the importance of that elections count. And my grandkids, my kids, yours, everybody on the screen, sadly, their lives are going to be dominated by these people on the Supreme Court. Now, there have been justices through the years, and I think covered the court itself once or twice directly. But as you know, through history, there have been justices who have surprised people and have tacked the other way from what they were chosen to be. So those are the only examples I can think of.
Thank you.
As troubling as it is.
Right. Wayne?
Pierre, you mentioned before money talks in politics, and I wanted to talk a little bit more about that from two perspectives. One is maybe it doesn't. I think about all of the money that the Republicans threw into all of these races, and it couldn't overcome the fact that they had low quality candidates. And then I also think the other one, and it may be, we got a lot of emails from a lot of candidates about where they stood in terms of money. But for example, I think Val Demings for a while was actually outraising Marco Rubio, and it really didn't matter. So, so that's what I mean. I mean, does money really matter? And I think, I'm sure our instinct is to say, of course it does. But let's talk about how it really makes differences and whether or not it can overcome, for example, poor candidate quality.
Peter, I'm Wayne's wife, Judy, and I just want to add on to that. Can you also address the issue of dark money in politics?
Yeah, I'm not an election law or funding expert, but look, money pays for commercials, money pays for campaign staffs, for buses. Campaigns can't get off the ground to begin with without a big war chest. And that's why we're already going to start hearing my wife and I are already hearing people, she's been an active Democrat and I've been an active nothing for many years. But, we're hearing for people looking for money for 2024 already. You make a point, though, about the money that was spent by the Republicans this time around. I mean, Mitch McConnell has to have a massive case of heartburn right now. He has this outside Senate leadership fund. They spent more than $230 million on a midterm election, and they obviously don't have much to show for it. Because again, going back to Trump, he chose these losers. And even after Trump's candidates lost, McConnell now is hearing from some Senate Republicans who blamed him for not spending enough of that $230 million on their races. Case in point, in Arizona, they thought that this guy, Blake Masters, who ran against Mark Kelly, should have gotten more money from McConnell. So, this time around, we may have seen the fact that the money didn't make that huge of a difference because of the quality of the candidates. But if they would have chosen better candidates and funded the right places, we'd be seeing a Senate and a House majority now, I think.
Okay, I'm going to call on Lee in a minute, but one of the things I was thinking about with the solicitation of money for candidates is I was trying to figure out why on election day itself, I continued to have requests for money saying that, we're very close and we need, throw in your $5, $10, whatever it is, when obviously that money is not going to put anybody over the top on election day when ballots are being cast. Now, I guess to your point before, it takes a lot of money to pay the staffs. They need to have the war chest. But, the insinuation by the email solicitation that I got was that it was going to actually have an impact on the election, not to restore their war chest.
Yeah, I mean, we got that too, unless they were in tight races and they thought they were going to need it for a runoff or to help with expenses if they demanded a recount, that sort of thing. But yeah, this cycle they just kept asking constantly until the very end. And of course now, my wife and some of her friends, my wife Elizabeth and some of her friends have sort of a competition going as to which one has received more pleas for money from Reverend Warnock in Georgia. So, I mean, we were sitting together and each of them are receiving texts from the Warnock campaign saying, send me money. I've got to beat Herschel Walker.
Yeah, I got 4 yesterday from Warnock. Just amazing. Lee?
Well, are you friends? Because you're both clergy, I mean.
Yeah, we're real tight.
First of all, let me just say thank you for the presentation, which is fascinating. I'd like you to comment on the future of Donald Trump. And the reason that I'm asking that is because I think it's just inextricably tied to the future of all of us. Many people would just like him to go away and fade into the woodwork, but that is extremely unlikely considering he has now thrown his hat into the ring for 2024. But as I look at how the various scenarios might play out, it's actually kind of scary. I mean, one possibility is he gets into a campaign and like he did in 2016, just basically beats away each of his Republican opponents and gets the nomination. You know, that in itself is very scary, but if he doesn't get the nomination, he may burn down the Republican Party, which I guess one side of me says that wouldn't be so bad. If he actually wins the nomination, you know, one possibility is he becomes president again, which is unthinkable. But if he doesn't, if he loses the election, he'll claim that it's rigged and start a civil war possibly. And then on the totally opposite end, what should happen is he should go to prison for all of the crimes that he has committed. But if he goes to prison, then he won't do so without having all of the white supremacists avenge what has happened to him, and God knows what happens to us then. So it all seems pretty bleak when I play it out that way, and I'm wondering if you can talk me down from the ceiling.
I wish I could, Lee. I mean, it is bleak. The man's staying power is unbelievable. Although, you know, if you take just the tone of the other night and the whole scene, first of all, I don't understand how my dad of blessed memory, who introduced me to politics in Southern Illinois. It's a long story that I won't go into, but he was very active as a Democrat. He used to say that, you know, the people get what they deserve. And, you know, in Donald Trump's case, I guess maybe that's an overreach. But, you know, his decision to rerun for president, you know, raises, you know, just so many fundamental questions that you've mentioned. And you wonder about his staying power as a guy who seemed to be pretty worn down the other night. It just seemed like he was going through the motions. I mean, a couple of my friends who were there covering said that people were going for the doors. They were going for the exits and the security blocked them from leaving. I mean, I would have gotten on my phone and called the fire marshal and said, hey, you know, but seriously, you wonder about the fate of all of the investigations. You said he could end up in jail. And was this a motivating factor? I think it was a huge motivating factor for him to make the announcement when he did. This is keeping his lawyers, if he pays them, those that he pays, and the Justice Department very, very busy. And you got to wonder, you know, what is going through the mind of Merrick Garland? Is he going to take what would be this historic legal and, yes, political step in prosecuting Donald Trump? And what are the implications going to be if the prosecutors charge Trump and fail to win a conviction? I mean, I think that would be, if he is charged and it does go to court, I can't imagine that happening. It seems like they have the goods on him, especially taking those papers, those sensitive intelligence papers down to Florida. But, you know, what is clear that Garland has made clear over and over again, and a lot of legal experts, former federal prosecutors and so forth, members of Congress with legal backgrounds, that Donald Trump is a private citizen, even during the campaign, and he can't have the protections from being prosecuted that he enjoyed as president and that he put into effect. So, you know, I set aside a quote that I saw from, let's see, Andrew Weissman is a former federal prosecutor and a NYU law professor. I saw he tweeted the other day, if running for president inoculated you from being indicted by DOJ, the entire Gambino family would be candidates. But, you know, it is, you know, he does have this staying power. And maybe, you know, maybe this is wishful thinking, Lee, but maybe his base is being just a little bit exaggerated at this point. There are plenty of Republicans who'd like to see him go away. And you just have to wonder, will DeSantis, will Glenn Youngkin, to a lesser degree, a very moderate Republican and highly respected, soon to be former Governor Hogan of Maryland, you know, he's been very serious about looking into launching a candidacy. Will they do it? Will some Republican senators, you know, if they sense any weakness, they'll jump. But, you know, they also know what Trump can do to somebody. I mean, he's like a meat grinder with these nicknames, and, you know, you just have to wonder, how can Ted Cruz be praising this guy after he called him Lying Ted and made fun of Ted Cruz's wife's political appearance, I mean, physical appearance. You know, Marco Rubio, little Marco, you know, how can these people kowtow to him the way they do? And again, it just goes back to they're afraid of his base.
Thank you.
Jeff, I saw your hand up before. Did you, you're passing? Okay. Norm?
There's all this speculation about whether Biden is going to run. There seems to be the general thought that if he runs, he's automatically going to be the nominee. I wonder what your thoughts are about a scenario like Lyndon Johnson, who was presumed the nominee until somebody, and I don't think it was Bobby Kennedy, I think it was someone before Bobby Kennedy, who first said he's going to run against him. And once he started to get a little bit of support, all of a sudden the floodgates opened, and then Johnson pulled out. And I wonder what your thought is on that kind of scenario occurring rather than Biden becoming the automatic nominee.
Well, I think it's quite possible that there's someone out there who, you know, has run out of patience, you know, in terms of keeping their own political ambitions in check, and they might jump in. I have to be honest and say I'm a little too far removed from the scene to know who that would be. I don't know how a very ambitious Amy Klobuchar would feel about running against an incumbent president. I covered the last campaign of someone who did try to do that, and that was Ted Kennedy against Jimmy Carter in 1980. And, you know, it was, you know, Ted Kennedy was dogged by Chappaquiddick at the time, and at every stop there were people holding up signs saying, you know, remember Mary Jo Kopechne. But he made Carter's life politically miserable, and he weakened Jimmy Carter. I'm not saying Jimmy Carter would have defeated Ronald Reagan, because I don't think that he, you know, that he would have. But it was quite a political spectacle to cover. And to a lesser degree, thankfully, I didn't have to be in his presence too many times, but Pat Buchanan did the same thing to George H.W. Bush. And I think, well, Pat Buchanan was a bigger bigot than Donald Trump. I could tell you a couple of anti-Semitic incidents that I covered in his presence, but I really don't want to foul our discussion by talking about Pat Buchanan. But those are two examples of people who weakened an incumbent president. I just, you know, it's going to be interesting to see. I think Bill Biden said that he's going to take some time off over the holidays and go back to Delaware, to his cherished home there, and chill out and talk to the family. And you just have to wonder whether his wife wants him to persist in this, but it's pretty tough. It's something that he wanted all of his life through tragedy and trial and so forth, and he has it, and it'd be tough to give up the White House for sure.
Barbara?
Last night, hello?
Yes.
Last night on MSNBC, Lawrence O'Donnell opined that an impeachment of Joe Biden would have similar results to the Republicans' attempt against Bill Clinton. In other words, it was a great favor to the Democrats. I wonder if you see that as a realistic scenario.
Absolutely, even
uh,
more so probably.
And would you see that carrying over to someone else if Biden chose not to run?
Yeah, I mean, I just think that the public has had it. The public's going to want action. They don't want a fake impeachment spectacle going on Capitol Hill when we have so many pressing problems in this country, starting with the economy. I mean, the Republicans have spoke all, through the entire campaign, and they very rightfully picked that up as the pocketbook issue, but they haven't told us exactly what they're going to do to make it go away, something that was caused by a combination of the pandemic and the war in Ukraine that were, totally out of Biden's hands. So yeah, I've been thinking the same way, that if they do go ahead with this impeachment, if they can even get it to the floor, even if they don't get it to the floor, the public is not going to be too happy about it. So
There was a weird thing that I saw suggested by Steve Schmidt regarding the House of Representatives. And he said that the Democrats should unite to try to have Liz Cheney become the Speaker of the House, and at the same time peel off some of the more moderate Republicans to have that, make that happen. I looked at that as thinking, okay, I think Liz Cheney gained a lot of respect through the January 6th committee, but philosophically, she is so far away from a democratic philosophy or a liberal philosophy as anybody. So, I mean, does that sound as preposterous to you as it does to me?
yeah, it does. But I'll tell you one thing: I'm going to be watching that woman's future very closely. I hope she's got something really better in store than being a talking head on one of the Hollywood Square type setups that we see on all these shows on the cables.
Right. Yeah. I mean,
she's got guts, whether you agree with her politics or not. She and Adam Kinzinger from Illinois are, really standouts on the committee, and that was another stroke of Nancy Pelosi's genius, putting those two on that committee. They've given the Republicans nothing but heartache over that.
Sure.
And if it could have gone the other way, they could have come up with some decent people to put on the committee, and it really could have gone the other way.
Okay,
I'm just wondering, I'm looking here at my son. I see you, Jonathan, and his childhood was marred by my constant absences on long foreign assignments and campaign trips. And I'm wondering if he can unmute and ask a question.
Thanks for putting me on the spot, Dad. I mean, I think my wonderful community here has asked so many great questions, and some of them I would have asked as well, but it's been quiet. But I guess I could ask, in general, what was your favorite experience over the 30 or 40 years that you covered the White House?
My favorite experience, and this is from a totally non-political standpoint, my favorite experience of my entire career, just of covering politics, and I hope we have some time here, Stu, for me to share some of these Jewish experiences.
Please, yes.
My favorite experience happened in Chicago, Illinois, in Grant Park, the night Barack Obama became president-elect of the United States. Michelle Maer, Jonathan's wife, was the very first person to tell me, you should pay attention to this guy, Obama. This was long before he was on the radar screen. He's really a very impressive guy. And I always credit my dear Michelle with saying that. You can tell her, Jonathan. She knows I've told her. But anyway, having grown up the way I did, where I did in Southern Illinois, in a town that had de facto segregation, and being taught by my parents to love all people, no matter what their color or religion. And you had to have that attitude to grow up where I did. And I'm glad I did grow up where I did. It was just so amazing to be there that night. I don't know, were any of you there? Raise your hands if any of you were there. But it was, yes, I see Wayne says he was there. It was just an electrifying historic moment to be there for that. And I covered both of his inaugurations too.
As long as we put Jonathan on the spot, I'll ask him a question.
Uh-oh.
Yeah. I was thinking it must have been incredible to be at the dinner table with your dad throughout his career. And I'm wondering what maybe one of the most memorable conversations was that you had with your dad based upon his a recent experience that he may have had at the White House.
So I remember the experiences of, going to the White House for when they would invite the press and their families, or going on these trips where my dad would have to be working most of the time, but would get some free time when we went out to Santa Barbara with Reagan several times when I was younger, and to Maine with the first George Bush, and those experiences. And, talking about things at the dinner table, I mean, just like every kid, you don't realize how different things are until you get out of your home. And then when I went to Arizona and would just, casually tell people my dad works at the White House, the first reaction would be like, no way, that's not true. And they thought I was, lying to them. And, just that reality that I grew up in was just so very different than, everywhere else in this country. That I didn't really kind of have that perspective until I got into my time at the university.
And
it's grown since
Jonathan's
then.
mom and I always told Jonathan and his sister Beth, don't talk about this at school. Don't, and they weren't, well, it was one of George H.W. Bush's favorite words. They weren't braggadocio, when it came to talking about these things anyway. I've got a lot of favorite memories of Jonathan. I should have set some of these pictures aside and really embarrassed him, but we have a picture of young Jonathan being held by Senator John Glenn when Jonathan was a little boy, and we went to a Senate, some kind of a Senate thing when I was covering the Senate, and Jonathan was interested in aviation even back then, and we told John Glenn, and John Glenn just picked up little Jonathan and was holding him, and we have this picture. And then we were at Kennebunkport once, and several times we were at Kennebunkport, and President George H.W. Bush asked Jonathan if he wanted to take a ride in his power boat. Remember that?
Yep.
And we have this picture. It says, "To Jonathan, here I am driving my boat, fast, ... real fast." So I think you have that. So anyway, a lot of memories. Should I share a couple of these Jewish stories with you real quick?
Please go ahead. Yeah.
Thank you, Jonathan. I love you. I learned very early on in my presidential travels to never underestimate the clout of people like all of you, the shul movers and shakers. I was in Venice, Italy with President Reagan for a big economic summit, and we had some downtime, as was often the case with Ronald Reagan, who liked to have a lot of downtime himself. And we went off to the Jewish ghetto, several Jewish colleagues and I, and some of the guys who weren't Jewish, and I'm sure a number of you have visited the first ghetto in the history of the world in Venice. And we wandered into a gift shop, and there was a gift shop on the corner of the ghetto, and the little Jewish Italian shopkeeper said, "What are you doing here?" And we said, "Well, we're here with the president." And in his thick Italian accent, he said, "Oh, the president of your shul?" So I learned about, and people always ask about Air Force One and what it was like to fly on Air Force One. And I guess last time I counted, I'd gone to 50 or 60, more than 50 countries on Air Force One, and all over this country, even better yet, on Air Force One. And the media seating on Air Force One is very cramped, and it's right in front of the galley. And the Air Force cooks are in the galley. So we always, appropriately, I must tell you, were the last ones served on the entire plane. And it was also only appropriate that we were sitting in the back of the plane. And these guys, these Air Force chefs, were really experts in the fine culinary art of trafe. They were experts in preparing pork dishes. I recall menus featuring apple pork sausage for breakfast, several versions of ham, barbecued pork ribs, pork meatballs, and the ever-present meat and cheese breakfast burrito, which they also love to put in front of us. And for those of us who keep kosher, follow the dietary laws, the chefs could always give us a substitute. I think a lot of times we just told them we were vegetarians. They didn't know from kosher. And so we, get peanut butter and jelly sandwiches, or tuna, bagels with cream cheese for breakfast, and maybe there'd be a vegetarian choice of last resort for dinner. One of my favorite stories, we had these elaborate White House press charters, which they no longer fly in most of the trips, but they charter these planes, and it was front to back first class service. If you didn't get a first class seat, you got an entire row to stretch out. The correspondents normally got the first class seats, and the camera crews and technicians and so forth preferred to have, seats where they could stretch out a whole row. And there was a Jewish guy who was really making a big deal on this charter. This was not Air Force One, this was an Air Force charter, making a big deal about keeping kosher. And he had ordered one of those glatt kosher, hermetically sealed meals that we're familiar with, and it wasn't thawed out. And this was on the flight over to Europe. It wasn't thawed out, and this guy made it just what for Jews was a very embarrassing production about that. And going back, I noticed that he's eating, there was a big platter, and it had lox on one side and shrimp on the other on the same platter. And this guy he comes up to me and he says, "Did you have the lox?" And I said, "Well, no, I mean, it's got like shrimp juice all over it. I'm not eating the lox." I said, "How can you possibly be eating the lox when you're so strict?" And he says, "Well, it's got a mechitza made out of lettuce between the shrimp, between the shrimp and the lox." So, everybody's got their own kosher. What can I say? One of my most memorable trips was in 1988 to what Ronald Reagan called the evil empire, to the Soviet Union, to Moscow. And on the way over there, we stopped in Helsinki for just, again, Reagan taking some downtime before he went in for his meetings with Gorbachev. And I went to this human rights gathering, and this rabbi somehow picked me out of the crowd of, I think he was not a Chabad rabbi, but an Orthodox rabbi. And he said, you're going to Russia? Yeah, I said, yes. And he said, would you take some humashas to some Russian Jews? And I said, well, I am going to interview some refuseniks when I get there. I had made arrangements before the trip to make contact with refuseniks while I was there, so we would tell their story. And so he gave me he said, "I'll meet you tomorrow." And I met him the next day, and he had like 8 of these very, very heavy prayer books. He actually had more than that, and I took 8 of them, and I put them under my equipment in my radio tape recorders and so forth that we traveled then. And we got to Moscow. I was on the Air Force One pool, so I was very fortunate that being on Air Force One, our luggage wasn't inspected. The people on the charter had their luggage inspected for anything like that. And I don't know that the Russians, the Soviets at the time, really would have made quibbled about bringing in prayer books, but we were told not to. So fast forward a couple of days later, and got in a cab. I was told by the Soviet Jewry advocacy group here in Washington, to take a cab away from the hotel because all the cab drivers around the hotel were probably, you know, snitches, KGB, whatever. I walked several blocks and got into this cab and handed him the address because I couldn't read Cyrillic. And we go through this birch tree forest and we end up at this dilapidated apartment complex. And I had the apartment number and I looked up and there was a mezuzah on the door. And I knocked on the door and I was so anxious to give this guy the books. And I reached into my satchel and pulled out these books. And he put his fingers to his mouth and he pointed to the ceiling to light fixture, like, you know, trying to tell me that it was bugged. And he said in English, "Thank you for bringing toys to my children." And we went inside and he told just an awful story. And he wanted his story, obviously he wanted his story out. He'd had it. They had put him in prison. They'd done all kinds of things to him. He was an engineer and they turned him into a janitor. And his wife had had a baby and she lost her ability to nurse because of the treatment that they were getting. And it was just a very compelling story. And there was also a guy there from Lithuania. And he too wanted a story. And I still remember just echoes. And I know this will resonate with you, Cantor, and with everyone. He said, "My daughter wants to have a bat mitzvah. And she keeps saying, 'Papa, why won't they let us go?'" And of course, that sounded like, you know, let my people go. And happily, eventually, they both were able to emigrate to Israel. The first guy showed up at the White House just to thank President George H.W. Bush for helping to press the causes of the refuseniks. And sadly, this guy's name was Yuli Kasharovsky. He moved to Israel, and just a couple of years ago, for some reason, he was up trimming a tree in his yard and he fell out and died. And I was, you know, quite shocked and saddened to hear about that. And I moderated a program with Natan Sharansky in St. Louis last year. And I asked him if he ever met Kasharovsky. And he said, "Oh, yes, you know that sadly, he made it to Israel, but he died there too." So anyway, that was a very poignant story. Another poignant story, as I watch the clock here, Jonathan will remember I was in Mexico City for covering the 1985 earthquake there. And I was stationed outside a children's hospital that had pancaked from multi-stories to just a pile of rubble. And I was there on Yom Kippur. It's the only Yom Kippur that I ever worked. But the day before, I went to Kol Nidre services. I found a shul and I went to Kol Nidre services. And I just, when you get to the point of the prayer of who shall live and who shall die, that really stuck with me. It just really, you know, I felt it in my kishkes, who shall live and who shall die. And in 2005, I went to the tsunami region with former presidents George H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton. And we went from place to place looking at all of this devastation from that terrible earthquake and tsunami. And we encountered a little man in, let's see, Thailand. And his entire village had been just wiped out. And he saw his wife and children washed away. And one of the presidents said to this guy, "What happened to your family?" And he said, and I just preserved this quote forever. He said, "They only live in my heart." So we're flying home. Bill Clinton peeled off and went to another destination. And it was just basically me, the Secret Service, CBS camera crew, and George H.W. Bush and his staff on this plane. And we're flying home and it's the middle of the night. And Bush and I were standing up in the cabin, looking down at the black ink of the Pacific Ocean below. And we were just reflecting on the fragility of life. And here I find myself talking to a guy who was a pilot who, you know, was shot down by the Japanese in World War II. He knows all about the fragility of life. He lost 2 crewmates. And we're talking about it. And I don't know why, but I said to him, "You know, Mr. President, my dear mother has a favorite saying, and I know you all have heard it, and you know it in Yiddish better than I: man plans and God laughs." And he said to me, "Man plans and God laughs. where does that come from? And I said, well, sir, it's an old Yiddish expression. And the old blue blood, George H.W. Bush, said, Yiddish, you say? That's fascinating. So, I have a lot of other stories that I had as a Jewish reporter, but I'll leave you with a couple of my favorites about the aforementioned Joe Lieberman. After the Democratic Convention that year, the first place that Joe Lieberman and Al Gore went was on a riverboat ride on the Mississippi River, the upper reaches of the Mississippi River, and we're floating along, and we are in the middle of nowhere. And to the surprise of the Secret Service and whatever security boats were around, some guy comes roaring up in a little fishing boat with an outboard motor on it, and he holds up a sign, Mazel Tov Joe. And that certainly got a laugh from Joe Lieberman and his wife Hadassah. But I guess my favorite story happened at one of those Florida condo communities that, it's like something out of a Seinfeld episode. And a woman came up and grabbed Joe Lieberman's hand and planted a big red lipstick smudge on his hand and just was so happy to meet Joe Lieberman. And she turns around to everybody within hearing distance and she says, "Oi, it was just like kissing the Torah."
Oh my. Well, that
You can't make it up.
No, you can't. That was a great finish. Peter, I can't thank you enough. I know this is the second time you've graced us with your presence, and I hope, I know you're a busy man, and I'm sure a lot of demand on your time. But,
no, I'm a has-been.
Yeah, but if we can get you again sometime when it's convenient, we certainly would like that, even just to hear more of the stories, which are absolutely wonderful. So,
well, more importantly, I look forward to the next time I'm in town and I can come to that Sunday Minion service with Jonathan and Joshua and Levi and Orly and be with you in shul.
I look forward to that as well. Okay, everybody, have hopefully I'll see you in shul before then, but have a good Thanksgiving. And I think we have a lot of things to be thankful for, even though we tend to commiserate a lot at these sessions. But we do have a lot of things to be thankful for. And we're thankful to Peter today for being with us. No current events next week. And then 2 weeks, we will meet again. Have a good rest of the day.
Thank you very much. I've really enjoyed being with all of you, and an early Shabbat Shalom.
Same to you.